on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and maybe take a moment to reflect on the fact that two things are happening. On one hand, Wade Grant, who formally did our annual acknowledgement here in 2023, I think, is now running for the Liberal Party in this part of the city, which is pretty exciting to see. And on the other end, there are faculty at UBC taking to court the need to acknowledge the traditional home and territory of the land in the first place, which is, this is the life we're in right now. So just take a moment to reflect on that, but also to say it's not political to recognize a Supreme Court decision. It's factual. It's not political to recognize a history of residential schools. It's factual. So let's not also play into that particular game. And in the spirit of that, I wanted to introduce Nicole Kaechele. For those of you who don't know her, she has, before coming back to do her PhD at UBC, she was living in the Newhawk Valley for at least a decade and worked closely with the Newhawk First Nation on part of what she's going to talk about today, the challenge of new governance regimes and parallel legal systems we are working with in the British Columbia context for exactly the reason we acknowledge land. So she has a really interesting history there, both in terms of building work and building relationships, which is a mutual thing, and is now extending that work beyond that. But today she will mostly talk about how she's been thinking about the nature of authority and the state.
Wait, help me get this on. Do you just hold it?
You can, but you might well flip it, I would.
Flip it, I would. If I can clip it. How terrible does that sound? Clipped. Good? Okay. Hello, everyone. As Terry said, I'm going to share a little bit about my PhD research with you. I'm going to start by talking about kind of the broad context of my research, then dig into some of the work that I've been doing and who I've been doing it with, and then talk about upcoming plans, because I'm not through this yet, and some of the implications for my research. So broadly, I do research within, as Sherry Pasternak writes, the suspended space between settler assertions of sovereignty and the vitality of Indigenous territorial jurisdiction. Or, as Ana Santo described in one of our recent lab meetings, the confusing tensions of colonizing and anti-colonizing processes happening at the same time. Or, after expressing some moderate panic around where all of this work might be headed, a Newhalcombe colleague and mentor of mine said, "It's going to be chaos, and it's going to be okay." So what these quotes refer to is the often messy spaces where Indigenous and state jurisdiction and authority are being negotiated. The quotes from the previous slide also refer to the broad context that my research sits within, that of reparations politics, and more specifically, the process of reconciliation between Indigenous nations and Canada. So I draw my understanding of reparations politics from philosophers, from legal scholars, and also from researchers in BC who have done really focused work with First Nation governments. More specifically, I do collaborative research with First Nation governments and organizations in two main areas: the revitalization of Indigenous legal systems and the negotiation of compensation agreements for historical loss. So I'm going to speak to both of these today. The first is very much focused in BC and specifically with two nations, the Newhalk and the Getinyao First Nations. And the second piece that I'll speak to is more broad, kind of across the Western provinces of Canada. And an important element of this research that kind of crosses all the threads is how to think about loss. So in the collaborative work that we do, we ask a lot of questions about why the past matters and what a reparative future might look like. As many of you already know, historically, state governments, the provincial and federal governments in Canada, have played a role in seeking to erase or write over or undermine Indigenous laws. So this was accomplished through the creation of Western laws that intentionally ignored and criminalized Indigenous peoples. And one important consequence of this practice was the dispossession, the literal stealing, of Indigenous homelands, which made it possible for state governments to pursue various kinds of resource extraction. So think mining, hydroelectricity, logging, and fisheries. It also meant that throughout a period in history, Indigenous laws were practiced quite differently, sometimes quietly, and sometimes they weren't taught to the next generation. So in partnership with the Nukhalk and the Git'in'yuw First Nations, separately, but together, we are documenting the foundations of their laws, their legal systems, so that they can be used both internally within their communities, but also in negotiations and active conversations with other levels of government. So we're developing tools to use in decision-making, in planning, and as my Nukhalk colleagues would say, in clearing the path for the next generation. And I wanted to show you, this is an infographic that we developed through our work at the Nukhalk Ancestral Governance Office to kind of help us think about law and its layers. So generally, laws help us govern ourselves and our societies. They can sometimes be described as a set of rules by which we agree to live and treat each other. So importantly, Indigenous laws are not Canadian laws. They are the distinct and diverse governing principles held within Indigenous societies. So the work that we're doing in Nukhalk and Git'in'yuw homelands is very specific to Indigenous law, which is happening separate from the Canadian state and the Canadian legal system. Today, I'm giving this presentation on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam First Nation. So acknowledging these homelands, for example, is a recognition of law. Through this, I'm respecting a protocol and a responsibility as a settler in how I conduct myself. And this is one important way, albeit perhaps less tangible than some, to acknowledge the importance of the past and the legacy this history brings with it today. So in our work in Nukhalk homelands, in order to think about law, through law, with law, we've adapted methods developed by the Indigenous Law Research Unit out of UVic and followed Nukhalk protocol to kind of document and interpret the foundations of Nunus-Klosnam, or the Nukhalk ancestral governance system. And I wanted to share this quote from Nukhalk Nation member Nuskamata, who describes Nukhalk sovereignty as more than a legal definition of land title and jurisdiction, but rather it's an understanding of all the active relationships that bind us to the land, our culture, language, history, families, villages, our ancestors and children, and to those yet unborn. It is a feeling as much as it is a responsibility. So really importantly, the work that we're doing together, it's not a how-to manual. It's not like, oh, if you end up in this situation, you need to behave in this way. But it's very much about documenting the kind of complexity of a very vibrant legal system so that individuals, community members, leaders can be using it and exercising it in their day-to-day life and their day-to-day work. It's very patient and it's very rigorous work and it's really fun. So together we've developed something called Nunus-Klosnamak, the Nukhalk Ancestral Governance Handbook, which was requested by Stadaldum, hereditary chiefs, so that they could be using it in their work. And now that we have this kind of working document, we're bringing it out to the community and into leadership rooms. So the picture on the top left is myself with my very close colleagues, Nunanda, Kaechele, and Jacob at an engagement session we had last May. And you can see behind us, there's kind of these blown up infographics that we have, one of which you saw today, and we'll see again in this presentation, where we were kind of sharing the work that we've been doing. The middle picture is a governance workshop we had in October with youth and elders, staff, leadership, both hereditary and elected, who want to be using this in their day-to-day work and negotiations. And so we were kind of actively talking about how to do that. So broadly, this research that we're doing on the revitalization of Indigenous laws is very much nested within and at the foreground of First Nations exercising their rights and their authority over their lands and waters. So this work is very much about what decisions get made. Think back to the logging, the mining, hydroelectricity pieces. But also more importantly, at least to me, it's about how decisions get made. So for example, who is sitting at the table making those decisions? What types of information are included? And how is that information felt and understood? So if we go back to this infographic once more, the kind of next set of my research that I'm going to speak to, which is more broadly across Western Canada, is much more situated within this kind of Aboriginal law space and the interaction between Indigenous governance and Western systems of governance. As I mentioned before, Canada has a legacy of pursuing resource extraction on Indigenous homelands without the consent or the partnership of Indigenous peoples. And this has led to losses. There's been impacts on the lands and the waters, and these losses have been felt, and they're multidimensional. So if you think about a mine or a dam or something related to resource extraction that has taken place, and you think about potential impacts, you may naturally go towards economic impacts. Those are pretty easy to measure in dollars. You might think about environmental impacts or physical health impacts. These are all really important, and they're a little bit more tangible. But there's a suite of potentially intangible impacts or harder to measure impacts that really matter to people and that have been affected. These might include mental health, governance, social relations, culture, spirituality, language, and this is just to name a few. And oftentimes, historically and in the present day, around kind of compensation agreements, these might get dismissed or overlooked. So the work that we're doing with a group of pretty awesome humans, it's very fun and it's very difficult, is to work with communities who have asked us to do this work, to kind of start thinking about losses from this multi-dimensional perspective. We do this by spending time on the lands and the waters, by listening to archival audio and interviews and recordings, and then by having workshops with community members to make sure we understand what those kind of multi-dimensional losses might be. We've also developed maps, and I just wanted to show this because this was created by a former PhD student, Steve Chanel, who's really fantastic to work with. And so he helped us in one case where a community had been impacted by a dam to kind of show the water bodies from 1959 compared to present day and the potential impacts. And so I will say this is not to show that, this is not to suggest that it shows all the impacts that might have taken place. Water moves in many ways and things change from season to season, but rather it's kind of a stark representation of how things might have been felt on the land, and it really has started conversations with community members. So this work that we're doing, coming back to kind of this graph that shows maybe partial impacts or the pieces that might have been dismissed. When we're kind of through at least the portion of the work that we've been asked to do, it might look a little bit more like this, with those multidimensional impacts more clear and more visible. And so I wanted to say on this slide that it's really not about making something whole. This isn't the work that we've been asked to do, and it's often not possible for various reasons anyways. But it is really about acknowledging past harms and making those kind of intangible pieces visible, both for community and in their negotiations, but also for the courts and for other bodies that may not really have understood or thought about what those impacts might be. And for me, because I really care about governance, it's about governance. And so it's the last time I'll show you this slide, but it kind of helps to kind of point out this very messy, or going back to the original quote from Niskamata, chaotic space in which I work, and this kind of space in between where Indigenous and Aboriginal law are interacting with and informing one another. And it's really about the negotiations that are taking place in this space and the choices that are getting made in this space. So for me, I think this really helps our collaborative work and the people I'm working with to think through these questions about, well, how do we think about loss? And why does the past matter? And what might a reparative future look like? So a couple of final pieces in terms of what we're hoping to do next with this research. The methods that I've been describing on understanding loss and negotiating compensation agreements, they are not set. So there's different methods being used across different contexts in Canada, and there are tons of different contexts in Canada where these conversations are happening. So there's kind of negotiations for historical impacts, like I've described. There's also something called the specific claims process. It's a very rigid process, but an important one. And there's also future-oriented agreements, such as the recent Haida title case. And so all of these are kind of interacting and affecting the compensation landscape that we're working within. So in partnership with the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, we're going to be hosting a workshop in October to bring together community members, practitioners, lawyers and policy folks to kind of openly discuss these methodological conundrums that we're all working within. And I'm really excited about this workshop because sometimes this work is not shared broadly. For various reasons, it needs to be kept confidential or you can't share it. And so this is going to really, I hope, create a space where we can kind of fill some of the gaps in everybody's understanding about why we're doing this work and how we're doing it. And then kind of further, and in addition to this, the work on the revitalization of Nuxalk and Gitanyao laws, this is really helping to kind of, I hope, demonstrate that law is not static and it's not frozen in time, but that it needs to be used and exercised to be an effective part of governance. So that work is very internal to the nations. It's very much in service to their priorities. And I'm hoping that it'll be, very much in service to their kind of ongoing negotiations on their own terms with other levels of government. So a couple of implications, which I've started to speak to. My hope is that this kind of, thank you, the work we're doing on the revitalization of Indigenous laws is going to provide a defensible basis from which First Nations are exercising their laws and governance systems to ground decision-making around jurisdiction and authority on their own terms. The work we're doing within compensation methods, I'm hoping, will provide tools that can advance policy and legal change, including really making tangible those intangible, making tangible and visible those intangible or harder to measure pieces. And, very broadly, I think this research advances practical applications of reparations and makes reconciliation commitments that we have more meaningful and grounded. And that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks. Hi. Hi, Mallory. Yeah, so the question was if this kind of intangible values and impacts piece has been brought to other levels of government and how that's gone, like what the reaction has been. Yeah, I would say that is, we're absolutely doing that work, both in the cases I've described, in other work I do, and then also just there's a vast network and array of people who are kind of actively doing this. And how is it going? It's tense. It's a tense space. It's really messy. I think that it's difficult when you have very different systems trying hard to communicate these kind of pieces in a way that has like tangible outcomes. I think there's examples in BC, and BC's a really important place where this is happening. There's examples where nations and provincial government especially have had good partnerships or are negotiating good outcomes. Gitanyao definitely have been in the news and the media reflecting some of those examples. And there's also there's processes. Some of the marine planning work provides kind of interesting, tangible examples of where nation governments and BC in particular have kind of negotiated a space where they're doing this work actively. But we're not on the other side, I would say. Yeah, it's still kind of an active space. Sorry, I saw behind you first. Thanks.
I guess I'm wondering where you go from here in terms of in this evidence to create change. Are you thinking that it mostly shows up as some form of legal battle and that everything's been
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so the question was where to go from here. How is this evidence and this work kind of where might it be used and how is it going to be used? Definitely the courts are one place where it's being actively negotiated. And so the compensation work that I spoke to, those negotiations are underway, and sometimes they'll end up in court and sometimes they won't. But the conversation between kind of these multiple legal systems is happening within the court. And I think that's a space where we might end up seeing change in the future for how things are done, because it has a really strong influence, obviously. But it's happening like on the kind of slightly smaller scale. I think there's examples of really recent accords. The Haida title case is a good example. The Gatineau Accord is an interesting example, where governments, First Nation and provincial, or First Nation provincial in Canada, have decided to work together outside of the courts. So within those contexts, there's kind of implementation agreements, and Indigenous laws are firmly rooted in those agreements, which is a really good thing, I think. But I think how they get implemented and roll out, we're still at the beginning of. The part that I get really excited about, and that I find the kind of most fulfilling and interesting, is when we're in community doing the work. And so the kind of picture I showed of the governance workshop we had last October, that's a really fun space where everybody is like, how do we actually do this? And we're trying to figure out how to do this work on a really like almost tiny scale. But I think that's the most meaningful scale, because once folks feel comfortable using their own legal systems in the ways they want to, I don't think it'll be so hard to imagine how it gets used in these larger scales, because we'll just know how to do it. And so to me, that's where it's happening, where it's really going to be meaningful. But it just takes a long time. And I think sometimes we're like, oh, we don't have time. And we might not, but we need it either way. Like there's no way to rush the process. So that's a bit of a bummer. Yeah.
You are working with two different communities, and I'm just wondering, what are the like similarities or convergences and the differences in the legal systems, and how are they maybe shaped by different geographies? Because one of them is more in the north, and one I didn't see them out very well, but maybe one is closer to water. I don't know, but yeah. You start from there.
Yeah, so the question was working with kind of two different nations in BC on the revitalization of Indigenous laws piece. What are the kind of connection points and differences? I mean, that's a really big question, to be honest, but I would say the connection points are that in both cases, there are community members who know exactly what their law is and who can speak to it really clearly. And in both cases, and this is the case for many nations in BC, but I don't have personal relationships across the board, is that these laws and these understandings are completely rooted within the places, the homelands where they come from. So, for example, I mean, Terry mentioned I lived in Newhawk homelands for nearly a decade. So I knew who the hereditary chief was, whose territory I lived on. I knew how to acknowledge in a respectful way that I was living in his space. I understood what resources were generally pulled from the river, which was right beside my house. And I understood the connection between the names to that place and what they might mean in terms of responsibilities. And so like, I think in both nations with whom I work, that understanding is there, and there's a firm rootedness and connection to the lands and waters. In terms of the legal systems, there's tons of differences. And I think that's something that's really complex. And I have a certain amount of empathy for BC and Canada, because just in BC alone, there are incredible differences across the legal systems that are held within nations. And those differences are really important when it comes to decision making. So I won't get into specifics, but certainly how Newhawk and Gatineau leadership make decisions, like literally the process, is not the same. So that's tricky.
In English language, we use the word law for rules that are written, specified in ways that we may not have actually do how it's work for Indigenous. And,
right.
And I'm interested in both different the extent to which there was a community before that they were maybe they were operating as like systems of one that, you know, and I'm interested to hear the extent to which they were represented in static form at any time, and the difficulties of the founders and to then translate that kind of dynamic system of, you know, somewhat codified norms into more entrenched static laws for the sake of meshing with
Yes. I'm not sure how to repeat the question. I'll try and summarize. Kai asked, I mean, when we think of law, we think of kind of these written norms and rules, and that might not have been how it was historically, especially if these laws weren't written down. So just to kind of speak to that process of what it's like to kind of codify or write down the law and what that does to the nature of law. But a fair. I mean, I wish Kaechele and Unanda were here right now because they'd be like, you shouldn't answer this question. So I'll try. They're not online either, I don't think. But okay, so I think the important thing is that like law, like when I think about law, these are the stories that we tell ourselves about the way the world is or should be or how we should be in it, right? And so those stories within what I've learned, for example, in Nuxalk law, those stories can change and do change depending on who your family is and who your ancestors are and the place where they lived and the relationships that they had in those places historically. And so I think that's the same today. So in Nuxalk, we have kind of 4 foundations of law that we speak to. One of them is Smayusta, which are roughly translated as origin stories. And so those stories might change. You will have a different Smayusta than I will have, and they might be told differently if you were a child in the family or you were a matriarch in the family. And so I think that was the case historically, and that's very much the case now. And something that one of my colleagues, Niskamata, has said to me before is like, what's really important about law is that it can continue to evolve and change. So we could recreate Smayusta that help us think through the times we're in now. So one of the challenges is that, for example, I showed you a picture of the Nunuskhosnamak, the governance handbook. We've written that down. This is like probably about 10 years worth of work. So I started the work prior to my PhD. And now that we have it written down, my colleagues Kaechele and Unanda, they really don't like seeing it written down. Kaechele is like, this isn't how we talk about it. Like, this isn't consistent. So we're trying to figure out a way to kind of honor the fluidity of law in a way that it can still be written down and understood. But it makes it really tricky for working in negotiations with other levels of government because you need certainty, you need efficiency, you need a clear process. And that is something that we can develop now for the sake of the work, but it might not be exactly how it would have been done. And so I think there are choices that are getting made because Erica Gavinos, who used to be a PhD student here, said it really well. Like, we can make these strategic choices in different places because we have different end goals, and it's still all part of law. It's all part of governance. It's all okay, even if it's not how things were done historically. So I think that kind of not being frozen in time piece is critical for this work, that we can be creative and imaginative, and it's still law. Like, it still is something really solid. Yeah. Okay.
Do you think it can be useful to share and learn experiences with other colonized common law nations, for instance, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, on how Indigenous courts and judicial systems can be strengthened?
Yeah, do I think it's useful to kind of think about how other common law nations who have faced maybe similar experiences, can we kind of share and learn from each other? Absolutely. So that work is happening it happens in all different spaces currently, but also even just for my PhD research, understanding some of the recent case law in Australia has been really helpful in thinking about compensation and how compensation specifically for intangible or harder to measure loss is being considered in those systems. And so I think personally, I could do a better job of remembering there's a world outside of BC and Western Canada, because when you do this work, you're just like, well, I guess we all do with our research, right? You get like really hyper-focused. So yes, I think there's a benefit to that. I think there's a lot to learn and a lot of like cross-learning that we can do. Yeah. Thanks. Barry, I'm just gonna hold it for you. Yeah. Yeah, I could. There you go. Good luck. Thank you. Good luck.
Oh. So while they get the slides set up, I will have the privilege of introducing Barry. So Momodou Barry is a second-year master's student, just finishing up his master's thesis here in IRES. Barry has come from a farming family in the Gambia in West Africa, and he has really drawn a lot of experience from his background and his family relations in the Gambia into his master's project on climate resilience and food security. He has an undergraduate degree in business from Shimla University in India, and also an MBA from Asia University in Taiwan, where he wrote a highly lauded thesis entitled "The Determinants of Internal Auditing Effectiveness in the Public Sector, a case study in the selected Gambian public sector offices." And Barry also serves as a global ambassador for human rights and peace with the International Human Rights Advisory Council. So it's really cool. I've learned so much from, I think we all have learned so much from Barry over this last couple of years as an entrepreneur, a social activist. He's been involved in several nonprofit organizations supporting sustainable development goals more broadly, and he's visited more than 25 countries. He supported us last year on our Light Farm project, bringing in an animal production module, and he has conducted mixed methods research back in his home communities last summer and fall on understanding the drivers of food security and climate resilience. And I am happy to say he's already finished a full first draft of his thesis, which I think is a record for people in my group. So I really look forward to hearing this next iteration, the next draft, and learning for you as you go forward.
Okay, thank you. Hello. All right. Thank you so much, Hannah, for that amazing introduction. So my name is Momodou Barry, and I'm working with Hannah Whitman and Tara Scottfield on this project. And we are looking at climate resiliences, agricultural practices, drivers of smallholder farmers' food security in the Gambia. And so in this presentation, I'll be talking through the research background, the research framework, methodology, results, and discussion and conclusion. But just to say, this is just preliminary. We are still working on refining this to make it look better. And so as we know that in our current generation, one of the most significant challenges we face is climate change due to the increasement of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And we have come to realization that we have exceeded the 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrialization. And this is pretty alarming because it will keep increasing to 0.3, to 0.1, to 0.3 if we don't limit how much emission we give to the atmosphere. And also, this has narrowed it down to extreme weather patterns happening around the world, like flooding, climate change, and also increasing temperatures with smallholder farmers. And also, this has become an impact on our life and ecosystem services, because if these systems are affected, it affects our ability to produce food. And also, it also damages the ecosystem diversity. So most of the most impacted people with this is the smallholder farmers. And looking at one of the most vulnerable regions in the world, which is sub-Saharan Africa, where it is expected that temperatures will increase above 2 degrees Celsius in the year 2100, or above 3 to 6 degrees Celsius if these emissions keep increasing at current rate. So this is highly alarming. Particularly this region is highly vulnerable because its agricultural system solely depends on rainfall agriculture. And if the temperature is bad or the climate is bad, means these farmers don't know how to do their farming. They can't predict the weather. They don't know when to expect rainfall, and also drought keep increasing. And once these things affect the agricultural systems, because these systems depends on rainfed, it also affects the smallholders' food security. And this is all due to the extreme weather patterns, such as storms, irregular rainfall, flooding, and drought. So while we talk about this, is because there is a disconnect between what the government wants and what these smallholder farmers want. The government, basically, their main mission is to do climate reduction by reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But this is going to take a long process. But what the smallholders recently need or urgently need is the ability to increase their resilience and capacity to adapt to climate change adaptation, because this is impacting their livelihood and their daily lives. So because of that, the governments in this region have come up with different type of policies and initiatives to help tackle this. But there's a problem. Even though there have been so many funding from the World Bank and the FAO and the UN to these vulnerable regions, there tend to be low climate resilient and adaptation strategies and policies. And this is all due to political corruptions of the system that have been implemented by governance, and which has led to a policy gap in the systems. Because if there's a corruption, the money is not flowing well. So the people that really need this are not getting it. And also low coordination, which is also going back to the corruption of the system. And one of the most things people talk about when they talk about climate change is they forget about the impact of colonization, because colonization has brought in weakened indigenous knowledge by making it more Eurocentric to these farmers. And also land tenure systems such as policy right, property rights, which we are not common in Africa back in the days. And also extractive of resources whereby timber and natural resources have been extracted to be taken abroad for processing, and these countries just don't benefit anything from it. So what happened? Things are not working. Things need to be done. So that's where several adaptation strategies in sub-Saharan Africa are self-governing, meaning they are not formally implemented by the government. This is normally by these smallholder farmers who come up with these strategies because it has been generational. So they depend normally on Zaid methods or mule making, crop diversification, and livestock barter trading, which I have experienced when I was there. But there's a problem still. This is not working because the population of sub-Saharan Africa, about 30% of them are still food insecure. The money, the policies, the initiatives, these are self-governing initiatives these smallholders have cropped up are not working. But the problem to that is, addition to this, there are other factors that are contributing to their food insecurity. These are the institutional factors and the household factors, the ecological factors, and the agricultural practices these farmers are using, which we will discuss later on, because these are all affecting their food insecurity as well. So I would like to talk about my favorite country in the world, which is the Gambia. And it's a small country in West Africa, with 75% of its population is employed under the agricultural sector. And this agricultural sector contributes to 25% of the country's GDP. This is huge. So, but still, the agricultural sector is the most vulnerable in the Gambia, because these farmers makes up 75% of the people living below the poverty line due to the climate change impact on their production. And because of this, the government has come up with different strategies, policies to tackle this, as we mentioned earlier. And some of these policies are here. They have a lot of policies since 1965 up to date, and some of them are still ongoing. And here we have projects that were implemented in the Gambia, and some of them are still going, all in the area to tackle climate change and to increase food insecurity in the Gambia. But still, there's a problem. A lot of things are happening, it's not working. But then in this study, what we are really trying to focus on is one of my favorite project initiative in the Gambia called the IRES Managed Irrigation Project. This project was implemented between the year 2005 to 2011 in the Central Bank of the Gambia. And its main purpose was to target climate resilient indicators, such as ecological indicators, institutional, and also to improve resilient agricultural practices and household. But still, it didn't work. And the most alarming thing is when you look at the gap between 2022 and 2023, there's a 3% increase of food insecurity, which is really bad in our modern time, despite all the funding happening, despite all the meetings we are attending abroad about climate change. So that's why we decided to work on this project, was to see how farmers in this area are affected by food insecurity. Previous studies has all talked about different ways to tackle climate change. Some people have come up with various approaches to help farmers, community, to help how farmers can become climate resilient. Others have talked about how climate change impact food security. And most of them has recommended, like countering food security through institutional household, climate resilient agricultural practices. But still, there is limited studies that really talks about how these factors that they recommended hinder food security or improve food security. And this is where our research comes in. So for example, when you look at the limitation exploration of hindering indicators, limited studies have talked about how household, institutional, ecological, and agricultural practices can hinder or improve food insecurity. And then another one is the limited focus on institutional household and ecological practices in the Gambia. There have been no research, to my own understanding of literature, particularly focusing on the Gambia, that try to discuss this. And then methodological gap in this study is that fewer studies have used a mixed method on understanding how these factors affect food security in developing countries. So our main research question was born out of this. Like, what effect does climate resilient indicators and agricultural practices has on food security? And then our main goal here is basically just to examine the relationship between these whole indicators in the Central River region of the Gambia, and to investigate which of these drivers have the biggest impact on food security. And as well, to examine which of these factors affect the two farmers we are studying in the Central region of the Gambia, which is the beneficiaries of the project we talked about, and the non-beneficiaries who are still living under the same condition, under the same system. And the construct of this study is the variables I described, the institutional resilient indicators, climate change, agricultural practices, household resilient, ecological factors. These are what this research will be based on. And so just to give you a brief explanation or definition of each, these are the institutional resilience are basically the indicators received either from the government that these farmers can use to enhance their adaptability strategy to climate change. And then you have the household resilient indicator. These are basically internal factors. These are in terms of education, number of household, age of household head in the Gambia that will help this household become financially stable and respond effectively to economic and environmental stresses. And the other one is the climate resilient agricultural practices, which are basically the most friendly way of doing farming without harming the environment, as I will call them. And then you have the ecological practices, which refers to the set of natural element and environmental management practices influencing agricultural practices in an ecosystem sustainability and resilience. And then food security, I took this one from the World Food Summit in 1996, how they describe food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economical access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food that meet their dietary needs and food reference for an active and healthy life. So we're now going into the research hypothesis and development. So all these studies, few studies have been done around the globe that have used the variables we mentioned to examine how they influence food security. So, and most of these factors affecting food security were policy, governance, access to market, and as well reduction in credit accessibility does reduce food security. So for this purpose, we have used institutional resilient indicators significantly impact food security is the proposed hypothesis for that. And then for hypothesis 2, we use the household resilient indicators, whereby we included the age of the household size, education level of the household head, farm size, and availability of labor, how it also increased food security or decreased food security. So the other hypothesis was born: household resilient indicators significantly impact food security. The climate resilient practices, as we define them, are crucial for enhancing food security, such as soil health, resilient against climate change, and others. So these are crop rotations and crop agroforestry and no farming. And then also we have this ecological factor, which is also part of the ones we are studying here, which indicates whether deforestation, access to irrigation, increase or decrease food security. And this is the research model we propose with the variables aligned to each of the construct in this study. So then the red ones basically means it negatively impacts food security. And then the methodology we use is the study area was in the central bank of the Gambia. It's the most vulnerable part in the Gambia, but that's where all the monies are going. Because the reason for this is because this area has access to water which is not salted. So when the water goes from down the Atlantic Ocean to there, it's already diluted, and farmers can grow rice along the swamps. And the reason for that, we also look at it, is that out of all the Gambia, these two areas, Janjanbureng and Puntauru, which are found in the study area, have the highest food insecurity, or most likely to become food insecure. So that's why we decided to study it in this place. And this is the place also where the farmer rice managed irrigation system is found. So what we did was the question was written in English. Also, we have, it's a mixed method. And we also have a semi-structured questionnaire. And then also we use the household food insecurity access scale, which we divided into two, for both the wet season and the dry season, to try to understand which of these seasons these farmers are more food insecure. And then, so we collected data from the beneficiaries of the farmer rice managed irrigation system and the non-beneficiaries who are living in the same environment. And for the qualitative, we use a descriptive, liability, confirmatory, and then we developed the structural equation modeling after everything was cleared out. So the results here, I will just go through them because I don't have much time, is that we have all this, but the most alarming thing is if you look at the gender, everything is male. And then you look at most of the age mate is between 50 to 64 of the people that answers this. And then the education level is basically, most of them have no education level or no education. And then the household heads are mostly male. And then you find out that the household size, most people are living under 7 to 9. And also they grow up 6 types of crops. And then like their farm size are basically 5 to 9 hectares. And then the income basically is from farm because it's 60 to 80% come from farm. And source of income is basically sale of crops. Then you find out off-farm income is basically 20 to 40%, they claim. And then most of their off-farm income sources come from self-employment, which does not include farming. Household origin, food origin comes from mostly the farm, 60 to 80%. Oop. All right. Okay, so this is the final structural equation modeling. So what you find here is that after analyzing everything, some of the questions were removed in the liability testing because they were not fitting the variables right, and then the validity testing was as well done to see how the construct measure properly. But then this is the final model we come up to understand how each of these affect food security, and all our hypotheses were supported by the proposed model we did. But then now I will just interpret what we have here. So what we have here is that you find out that for the non-beneficiaries and the beneficiaries in terms of institutional factors, you find out that the non-beneficiaries feel that like having institutional support is more helpful in terms of, let's say, credit access, access to market in the absence of a project. And then for household, you find out that most of the non-beneficiaries believe that having a educated household and diverse income also increase the household food security. And for the climate practices, most of the beneficiaries were more into that, and they feel that like having access to the project, which is the farmerized managed irrigation system, improve their improve their chances to practice climate practices. And then for the ecological also, the same thing applies for the non-beneficiaries, that they rather do agroforestry and other other factors that doesn't apply. So you were saying, all right. Okay, sorry, I don't have time. I got distracted by that timing, sorry. All right, I still had a lot to go, but you know. Yeah, sorry, I think I gave out my whole, maybe this is different presentation. So feel free to ask me any question to the, yeah, or I can just give the conclusion for the quantitative part, because this is where it stops. So what we are seeing here is that in terms of looking at who is more food insecure, what we found is that the beneficiaries are more food insecure with a mean of 3.2. But this is very small as compared to the non-beneficiary. The gap is small with just 17% difference. But it also shows you that the positive impact of the farmerized irrigation system on these farmers. But then looking at the standard deviation, it's also talk about the variation here. Looking at 0.51, what this shows you is that even though this group is more food insecure, but some people in this group are still less food insecure. And it all compounds down to the importance of the institutional support and the climate resilient practices they use. So that's all for the, for the quantitative. Thank you. Well, if you want me to continue, I'm more than happy, but I have to respect the time, right? Yes.
I'm curious where you see this headed now, like where, what you're passionate about for where this research is going to go.
Okay, so, all right, yeah. So what this research is going to get at the end, one of the implications is that we'll be able to make policies that are target-based. Because, for example, I feel like what is happening in the Gambia is one shoes fit all. They're just giving these finances to these farmers without really understanding their needs. Because at the end of the research, what you realize is that the institutional factors and the agricultural resident factors are more important to the beneficiaries because they have access to all this land and project financing and training, whereby the ecological and the household factors are more important to the non-beneficiaries. So I think this will help us have target interventions and policies in terms of distributing financial aid to these farmers in the same area. Yeah.
That dynamic is solved. World Bank and fund a lot of money in Africa. They're actually feeling like they're trying to feel good. But World Bank, the policies they put are not benefiting to them. And this is increasing insecurity because the African countries if you look at the amount of money that the people coming, you know, the- that's the thing that you start. You don't even have the money, you don't have the
Okay. Yeah, so I think that could be a mediating variable for future studies, looking at how imports affect this this framework. Yeah. Yes. Or behind. Sorry, can you repeat that? Okay, so the question is what factors relate more to food security in this particular region of the Gambia? So what we found here is that since we are looking at, one of the factors that stood out the most was the institutional support factor. Because when these farmers have access to credits and markets and safety nets, they tend to practice more smart agricultural practices in that area. But then at the same time, it is a divided thing because you have the beneficiaries who are saying like, oh, these are more important to us, and you have the non-beneficiaries who are saying household and ecological factors are more important to us. But the one of the factors that stood out the most and has a big impact on both group was the institutional factor. So these farmers, if they have support from the government in terms of access to credit, in terms of access to market, it will improve their food security. Yeah. Yes, so they are mostly rice farmers because that's why the Farmer Rice Managed Irrigation Project, which is part of the Green Revolution, was given to them because rice is the most stable food in the Gambia. It's what is eaten most in the Gambia, and then so we import more than we produce, but yet this is a food that we produce. Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot of work you've done for the last few months. So, trying to understand your kind of research design. So, there's many questions I don't have time to ask, but how was this project actually implemented? So, was it like a randomized trial? Like some farmers were adopting this project?
Okay, so the Farmer Rice Managed, you mean the Farmer Rice Managed? Oh, so he was asking how was the project implemented in the Gambia. So the Farmer Rice Managed Irrigation Project happened between 2005 to 2011. And then this was the time when the government was more interested in developing food sovereignty. Basically, that's what it was. But then the farmers went to the Central Bank of the Gambia, and some of these farmers have their farmlands next to the River Gambia. And so it's easier to have this irrigated water into their farms. And so the government gave funding to these farmers because they were rice farmers, and they're still rice farmers, to do this because the land belongs to them. No, you mean they all live in the same region of the same, it was all in the same region. They are all living together. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay. So yeah. So what I wanted to say was like institutional factor is one of the most important element for their food security. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Yes.
Farmers take on those more farming practices, but that doesn't look like that's represented in the structure. So
You mean the final result? This one?
it sounded like the structure that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Institutional factors enable
Okay. So what do you mean? Yeah, so what we are looking at three factors here and how they both influence food insecurity. We are not trying to integrate them as into climate institutional factors influence agricultural practices. We could go that route as well if we wish to, but that's for another research. But then here, what we are looking at is all these things has been implemented by the Gambian government. Some of them are internal from the farmers themselves, some of them are external. And so what we're trying to do is to look at which of these factors influence farmers' food security the most. That's why we have the institutional resilient indicators. And then you have, let's say, for example, capacity building, social safety network, policy, how policies will influence food insecurity. But we compound it and then call it the institutional resilient indicators. So we are not trying to say like it influenced the others. We're just trying to see how they all work together to achieve food insecurity. But then you can also say that if farmers, because the result here is that institutional factor is the most important factor for both these farmers. And so if farmers have access to credit, they'll most likely willing to use other agricultural resilient practices as well. Yeah. Okay, one more question, yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah, like I was surprised, and I'm still trying to go over it, because to me particularly, I always assume probably my pre-assumption was household resilient indicators will be one of the top, because I come from an environment where I always hear people talk about education is the key, and working is the key. But then looking at that particular environment, I might be biased in my statement here, but looking at that particular environment, it's just, having institutional resilient indicators have been one of the most important factors for food security in that region. Just shows you how people rely on aid from outside rather than from inside. So that was really surprising. All right, thank you.
The traditional ancestral and sea territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Our journey to learn about reconciliation and our lived experiences obviously are quite unique, and that is not the exception for Ilke, that has lived in many different countries and that have shaped her understanding and perspectives. I'll let her talk a little bit more about that when her presentation starts. You might realize that I'm not Claire, but I'm here presenting. I'm here to introduce one of the first people that I got to know here at IRES, my friend Ilke, who is going to show us one of her chapters from her PhD dissertation related to Galapagos. Let me just get the formal title, but it's Conservation of Landverts in the Agricultural Zone of Santa Cruz Island in the Galapagos. She also worked in this location for her master's project. So Ilke's journey here has been a very interesting one. She did her bachelor's degree at McGill in biology, and later went on to do an Erasmus Mundus master's Tropimundo that took her to various countries, including Belgium, French Guyana, Australia, and the Galapagos, where she started getting into this topic that she's going to talk to us about. And then she decided to pursue a PhD project, continuing that same line of work, where she has not only shown that she's very passionate about this topic, but she also discovered an interesting passion for teaching and being with students. And she has worked very hard on that. She went from being a TA and getting a biology TA award to also being a lecturer, and now even designing syllabus for one of the new courses with Claire. And she has also decided to take this even further and will be joining the University of Utah Valley next year as a professor. And so she's an NSERC graduate scholar and an UBC public scholar. So what else can we say about Ilke except that she's making us, the rest of us, look bad. So without further ado, I hand it over to you.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much, Mal. That was a very, very nice introduction. But sort of, I guess, to start off, sort of, as Mal alluded, I want to start off my presentation by recognizing that I am a foreign researcher in Galapagos. I am not Ecuadorian. And so I just want to start off by thanking everyone who's worked with me in Galapagos and has welcomed me there, and everyone who's shared their stories with me. So I am very appreciative that I get to work there. So with that, should I just use the... Yeah, sweet. Thank you. Awesome. So with that, as many of you know, we are currently in a biodiversity crisis. I don't know if the order of these totally makes sense, but it was a fun figure anyways. But biodiversity loss is really important because it compromises our ecosystems, it compromises human health, it compromises our well-being. And one of the major reasons for this biodiversity crisis has been agricultural intensification and expansion, which, as you can see here, has really increased over the last several hundred years with the increase in green and the increase in pasture lands as well. A very nice figure, thank you, Naveen. And so this has been one of the major causes of the global biodiversity crisis. As of right now, agriculture makes up about 45% of habitable land, which is quite a significant amount. But it's, not all bleak. This also represents a lot of opportunity. And so agricultural landscapes do hold a lot of potential for conservation. I thought this was a really nice image of what a working landscape can look like. And in fact, we can also promote biodiversity in agricultural landscapes without necessarily compromising yield. And so this is a really cool study that came out a few years ago, which is a second-order meta-analysis that compared diversified to simplified practices on farms. And as you can see here, for the diversified practices, we see a lot of these benefits, but you don't necessarily see a change in crop yield, which is really great because that is usually one of sort of the tension points in adopting these practices. However, to sort of move forward and integrate these, it's also really important that we understand relationships between biodiversity, between agricultural landscapes, and between people within this landscape. And so this is sort of the premise of my PhD, which I'm excited to finally sort of talk to you guys all about after all these years. And so my objective with my PhD is to understand the relationship between birds, specifically agricultural landscapes, and farmers in the Galapagos Islands. And so the Galapagos Islands, they're a set of islands off the coast of Ecuador. They're really famous for their high levels of biodiversity and their high levels of endemism, and that includes their birds. It is home to 35 native species in general and subspecies of land birds, including the famous Darwin's finches, known for helping to inspire the theory of evolution. And my work specifically takes place on Santa Cruz Island. It's the island with the largest human population, and so thus also the largest agricultural zone.
However, we've also seen a pretty big decline. There's an estimated only 1% of this really beautiful endemic Scalesia forest remaining. It has a lot of overlap with this agricultural zone. And so because of that, as well as some other threats, we've seen a pretty big decline in land birds over the last several decades. And this decline has been felt most strongly in the agricultural zone, as this paper that came out in 2017 shows. And so this really prompted us to want to, or researchers in Galapagos and people in Galapagos to want to understand what was happening more in the agricultural zone. And this is actually where I got to come in and this was what I did for my master's thesis. I actually got to be sort of the first person to focus on birds on a study in the agricultural zone. Most people tend to work more in the national park areas rather than the agricultural zone. And through this work, we found that on farms where there were more forest patches, especially forest patches with native trees, we saw an increase in land bird diversity and abundance. Maybe not super surprising, but still cool to be able to like go out and actually show that. And so that was really inspiring to me, and I felt like I was in a really sort of cool position, having made a lot of collaborations, and I really wanted to continue this on, and that's what inspired me to come here and do a PhD. And so I was also really excited to be in IRES, which is an interdisciplinary program, and sort of be able to approach my interest here, but from different, I guess, fields. And so I will be presenting to you a bit of an overview of what I've done in the last 2 years. And one of these approaches is an evolutionary ecology approach. I also have an ecological approach and then a social approach. And so these are sort of my different chapters, and we'll go through them one by one. Starting with the evolutionary ecology approach, which I have used to try to understand how the agricultural landscape is affecting Galapagos land birds. More specifically, I ask, are agricultural landscapes affecting evolutionary processes in Darwin's finches, with my hypothesis being that Darwin's finches are going to differ in beak morphology between national park site and agricultural sites if the agricultural landscape is having an effect on birds. And so for this work, I was in Galapagos from March to October in 2022. So spent a lot of time there working with an awesome field crew. And I identified 17 different sites. Most of these are in the agricultural zone of different farm types and sort of across the agricultural zone. And then we also have forest or undisturbed sites sort of a similar habitat to what you might find in the agricultural zone. And we were able to capture over 3,000 birds, which was really, really awesome. And the way we did that, for those of you not familiar with bird techniques, is that we used mist netting. These are sort of these specific nets made to capture birds. They're really hard to take pictures of because the birds are not supposed to see them. So you really have to get the right angle. So you can just kind of make it out here. But what's important is that, yeah, the birds don't see them. They fly into them, and then they sort of fall into these sorts of pockets. And then they kind of get stuck there until we come along and we carefully extract them from the net. And then they get placed in these sort of clean little bags where we put them on a little assembly line for processing. And this is what our field setup looked like. So here we have my awesome field crew that I got to work with the whole time I was there. And sort of a little messy, but yeah, this is what my life was like for every day for 8 months. And to this chapter in particular, what was important is that we were able to take measures. Some of the most relevant measures here are beak length, beak width, and beak depth. These are sort of the standard measures people have taken over a long time studying these finches. Beak length tends to be associated with food manipulation, whereas beak width and beak depth tend to be more associated with bite force, just so that you know that going in. And then we also took sort of other standard body measures that people generally take for birds, which are their tarsus length, wing length, and their mass. It gives you a bit more information about the bird. And so what did we find? Well, looking at, I'm going to show you the most interesting results. Looking at these 3 omnivorous species and looking at beak depth, we found that we did actually see differences in their beak widths between agricultural site and natural sites, where their beaks were smaller in agricultural sites compared to natural sites. This was mostly driven by these 2 species, the medium ground finch and the small tree finch. And then when we looked at beak depth, we actually saw the same thing. We found significant differences where beaks were smaller in agricultural sites compared to natural sites. Looking at insectivorous species, so these have different diets, so you would expect different pressures on their beaks. Here we are looking at beak length, beak width, and beak depth is what I'm going to show you. And we actually found no significant differences, but you can still see sort of the same trend of beaks being smaller in agricultural sites compared to natural sites, with here maybe beak length being a little more important, which also isn't too surprising since that's associated to food manipulation, which is more important than being able to crack down on things for insectivorous birds. And so with that, that sort of begged the question, okay, are these agricultural sites worse for these birds or not? And for that, using those other body measures, we were able to estimate body condition for each individual bird. And when I compared those between the different sites, we actually didn't find any significant differences between body conditions. So it doesn't seem like the agricultural sites are worse for the birds. They're just different, which they are. And so sort of what's left to do, I'm still wrapping up this analysis, but the last thing I still need to finish looking at is if we measured vegetation structures at each farm as well, and to see if those explain any of the differences in beak sizes. And here, so far, it seems like maybe the amount of trees or stand basal area might be important. Maybe that's related to food availability somehow, but I still need to sort of make sure that that is actually what the models are saying. So that's a preliminary. We'll see if it holds up. So sort of coming back to the question, are agricultural landscapes affecting evolutionary processes in Darwin's finches? Well, I can't necessarily say there's evolutionary processes going on here, but we can say that we found less wide and less deep beaks in agricultural sites compared to natural sites for omnivorous birds. Like I mentioned before, beak width and depth are correlated to bite force, and so the ability to crack hard seeds. And so this speaks to maybe there's some sort of a difference in seed availability that maybe is driving these differences. I kind of wish I had looked at all the seed availability that was there, but maybe that's a future project. And so maybe there's evolutionary processes that are being affected here, but I can't say that for sure. Maybe what's happening is ecological specialization. Maybe it's just, they are adapting to these landscapes, but it's not necessarily an evolutionary response. Maybe it's still within, the variability that you would normally see. Or maybe it's habitat choice. Maybe just the birds with the smaller beaks choose to go to the agricultural landscapes when they are moving around. So yeah, but we can say that there is some sort of an impact from the agricultural landscapes because clearly we are seeing these differences. And so with that, I'll move on to the next approach, which is my ecological approach. And this one I am using to understand the relationship that sort of how birds affect farmers. I'm really curious. One of my main question was asking what services and disservices are birds providing to farmers in Galapagos? And for this talk, I will be focusing, or most of my focus is actually around pest control. I'm curious about the potential role of Galapagos land birds as pest control agents. And so for this, while we were in the field collecting all these measures, we also collected a bunch of fecal samples, which is really cool because I was able to then bring those fecal samples to the lab. What we do is in the lab, I was able to extract DNA from all of these fecal samples. And then the next step is to use something called arthropod primers to amplify arthropod DNA. Basically, what this means is you're just inserting something which is going to recognize all the arthropod DNA in your samples, and it's going to replicate those a ton. So basically, you're left with mostly just a bunch of arthropod DNA in your samples. And then send those off to a sequencing center where they sequence it and they tell me what the DNA was in my samples. And now I have just matched the sequenced DNA to taxonomic databases. So now I can identify what insects or what arthropods were in these different samples. So what were these birds eating in terms of arthropods? And then the step I am still on, so I don't have results for this part yet, but I will soonish. So if you're interested, come chat with me in like a month. Is classifying all these different insects into, okay, are we seeing crop pests or are we seeing maybe natural enemies of crop pests, which would actually sort of be against pest control? But yeah, what sort of arthropods are they eating? So that's sort of the stage of this chapter. And so we'll move on to the last, which is a social approach. And for the social approach, I am actually asking the exact same question. What services and disservices are birds providing to farmers in Galapagos? But this time from the perspective of the farmer. And I'm also curious about asking, what are farmers' motivations and hesitations to planting native trees in the agricultural zones? And was the action that we had identified that could actually help increase land bird diversity and abundance. And so for this, I designed in-person surveys with a mix of multiple choice, Likert scale, and open-ended questions. And I was able to talk to 53 different farmers. Here are some pictures of the farmers I was able to talk to who were excited to get their picture taken. And as an overview of who I talked to and sort of what the landscape looks like there, most of the farmers I talked to were fruit and vegetable farmers, which wasn't a big surprise because these are the smallest farms, and so there's more of them. But I also talked to pasture farmers and coffee farmers and poultry or pig farmers. Those are sort of the main farm types. There was a pretty huge range in farm size, ranging from 0.2 hectares to 160 hectares. And then in terms of people that I talked to, my sample was almost like half male, female. About half had just gone to primary school, about half secondary school. Some had gone further, but not many. And then I was also curious about asking about Galapagos identity. The islands have a pretty recent history of colonization, just like in the last few decades. And so people have sort of different identity feelings to the island, which I thought would be interesting to include. And so I'll start off with their general perceptions about land birds. In green, we have the cultural ecosystem services. And as you can see, most farmers pretty strongly agreed with all of these cultural ecosystem service statements, indicating that they do think that they provide important cultural ecosystem services. In terms of regulating ecosystem services or pest control, there was more divide in opinions on whether they perceived the service or not. And then in terms of ecosystem disservices, which are the dark purple ones, you can see most farmers disagree. So they don't really think they provide too many disservices, but actually when we look at an economic burden or birds being bothersome, it's a pretty split opinion as to whether, these birds are providing disservices or not. I asked some specific questions about crop damage as well. Most farmers think that birds provide a little bit of crop damage, and of those who thought that they provided crop damage, they were a little bit concerned about it. Most of the crop damage was attributed to finches. It's sort of hard to tell the finches apart from what I've gathered, but so they just kind of group them into the category of finches, and these are the most pest species, I guess, for the farmers. And the main crops that are damaged are tomato, pepper, corn, and cucumber, but a whole range of other crops was also mentioned. And then in terms of pest control, also most farmers thought, okay, a little bit, the birds provide pest control. And here it was attributed to more species. The yellow warbler was the most mentioned for providing pest control, followed by the finches, which was pretty interesting because this is also the one that damages the crop. So they are able to recognize both these things. Followed by this Annie, which was also really interesting because I asked like species-specific questions as well that I'm not going to show today, but is actually the most hated bird, I will say, which is also, I think part of the reason is because it's an introduced bird. And so farmers recognize that, but they still also recognize that it also can provide pest control services. And so I was also curious, sort of using this, okay, what might be driving their disservice perspectives, because we saw more of a range of opinion here. And unsurprisingly, farmers who perceived more crop damage, they also perceived more disservices from birds generally. But interestingly, we also saw that farmers who had more of this Galapagos identity and who had a higher education perceived less disservices from birds. So that was pretty interesting. Now moving on to the last component, which was the willingness to plant native trees. Looking at the dark purple, most farmers were willing to plant native trees on their farms. Some were not. Of those who were willing, most were willing to plant a small amount, maybe 0 to 10%. And the main motivations was because trees provide shade or freshness, followed by the fact that trees, they found these native trees pretty. Or to conserve and protect nature. I am running out of time as well. So yeah, but I'm almost done. And so I categorized these into different value types, the most common being instrumental. And then in terms of hesitations, the main hesitation was a lack of space. and that these can interfere with production. And I categorize these again, and we see that the main is biophysical, so it's more related to reasons around their space or their farm rather than personal reasons. And so to conclude, we have seen that the agricultural landscape does seem to be affecting the birds to some degree. And in terms of the birds affecting the farmers, sort of to be seen for pest control, but they do provide, it seems like they provide cultural ecosystem services, as well as some disservices, especially in the form of harming crops. And in terms of farmers sort of affecting the landscape, which affects the birds, most farmers were pretty willing to plant trees, particularly because they provide shade, they're pretty, and to protect nature. But there are also some hesitations around lack of space and around that they interfere with production. And so with that, I will conclude saying that agricultural landscapes can potentially alter evolutionary processes, which is what we're seeing. Biodiversity impacts ecosystem services, and so this really directly impacts the farmers. So it's important to understand the processes that are happening, and that we do need to work towards solutions that work for both biodiversity and people. And so I'm really excited that in September, once I wrap up all these results, I get to go back to Galapagos, thanks to the Public Scholars Initiative, and sort of talk about these results with the farmers, hear their inputs, and sort of determine what next questions they might have or what they're interested in sort of continued research. And so I will end there. Sorry, I went a little over time. And I want to, thank all the farmers in Galapagos again. Thank Claire, who couldn't be here today. My field assistants, Works Lab members, and everyone else who's been involved. And thanks for your attention. I'll start here. Okay, good question. So the question is, why did I choose to study Darwin's finches? It started with my master's, and it just kind of happened. I was looking for a project in terms like something related to conservation, and for the way my master's was set up, Mauricio kind of mentioned it, but it was a little bit weird that it was like you're in different countries all the time, you're kind of hopping around, and in the end you're supposed to do a thesis. It can be like anywhere in the world, you just got to do a thesis somewhere. And so I had heard about the Charles Darwin Foundation like a while back through like podcasts, being a biologist. And so I randomly just emailed them and was like, I'm looking for a project. Are you looking for someone to do a project? I have some funding. And I didn't expect I'd hear back from them, but a month later they emailed me back. They're like, oh, we're actually looking for someone to do this work on birds in the agricultural zone. And I learned about birds, and it all kind of came together too, because for my undergrad thesis, it had been like in evolutionary ecology, and my professor there actually also works in the Galapagos, but I worked on fish for my undergrad, and so it all kind of came together, and that's how it happened. Good question. Yes. Like between the different sites, you mean? Yeah, good question. I still sort of need to put all that together, but yeah, just from being there, there were differences in terms of, I'd say probably bigger differences in terms of seasons than in terms of sites. There was a few species, they're not included in the analysis, the ones that I think are more, there was one particular that comes to mind, the vegetarian finch, and it was like, we didn't see it for the first while, and then all of a sudden it was just like there. So that's pretty interesting in terms of like, okay, what's happening with these dynamics. But something that I have looked at in the data too is how often we recaptured birds, and if we were recapturing them at the same sites or not. And so we actually did recapture quite a few birds, but almost all of them, I think it was like 90, there's maybe like 3 individuals that we captured at a different site. Everyone else we captured at the exact same site. So how much they're moving between sites in the zone, I can't say for sure, but from that data, it's telling me maybe they don't really move too much in between sites. Maybe if they're moving, I think it's more likely between like the arid zone and the highlands, depending on resources that are available, rather than like within a site or like within the agricultural zone, which is all more similar in terms of habitat. Good question. But yeah, it's very species dependent. Yes, Tatiana. Yeah, good question. What are some direct benefits for farmers knowing about my research? I'm really curious to hear what they're going to say and what they're going to think when I present it to them. I think actually the pest control results are probably going to be the most interesting for them, which I don't have yet. So to be seen. I think they're going to be really interested in that because I think from the surveys, clearly there's a lot of sort of divide in opinion, which I think also tells me there's just a lot of uncertainty around it, which to be fair, of course there's uncertainty around it, but we haven't really looked at it before. So I think they're going to find that really interesting. And then in terms of other benefits, I think the evolutionary ecology piece is maybe a little more directly applicable, but I think for the survey piece, it gives them sort of a cohesiveness, being like, look, no, this is something we're interested in, but these are maybe things we're interested in. I didn't show this part either, but I also asked them about incentives. Like, are you interested in incentives? What type of incentives? And so having like a list put together for them is something that, you know, actually is like, okay, these are things that most people are interested in. Something that's sort of, yeah, interesting in this community as well as the agricultural zone, it's like pretty wide, and transport is actually a big issue. Like there's not, people on the island aren't, most people don't have personal vehicles, and the transit is pretty unreliable and things are pretty far apart. So it's kind of hard to move around sometimes. And I think because of that, there's not always that much communication between different groups, especially maybe from different zones. There's like the farmers market once a week where maybe, you know, you come together, you talk to some people, but yeah, I think it's also just really interesting for them to see, okay, what are other people thinking? What are people thinking here? Yeah, so I'm actually really curious about that. I'm going to ask them. Yeah. Last question. Josephine's had her hand up for a while, so. Oh, okay. Dan, you can go. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering, like, what is sustaining this economy, given the fact that you showed that most of them are concerned about space.
Yeah.
Where are they selling you know, from your personal experience, where they're selling the fruit that they're mostly growing, and if it's like, is it mostly like a local on-island economy, or are they mostly selling to mainland? And so, like, what's constraining their ability to sustain themselves, basically?
Yeah, good question. So the question is, the question is big. It's about sort of how does the local economy work in terms of the farmers? Where do they fit in locally versus more broadly, and what's maybe limiting in that sense? Yeah, so to answer your question, it depends a little on the field. Most of it is local though, especially the fruit and vegetables, and a lot of the pasture ends up being pretty local. There's a lot of sort of like yogurt production and milk that is most of what the cows are, and fruit and vegetables is all local. They don't export any of it. There's actually a lot that gets imported from the mainland to Galapagos because there's more demand than they can supply. The coffee is a little bit different. The coffee does get exported internationally as well as locally. And so that one is a much bigger market. I have farmers who work with Starbucks, for example, which is kind of fun. And then in terms of, I already forget, in terms of like constraints, or is that sort of the? Oh, sorry. No, I know what I was missing. The economy, a lot of the local economy is driven by tourism, ecotourism. And so that's like what a lot of people depend on. And even like most of the farmers that I talk to, their main income is from farming, but sometimes they'll have sort of when they have a secondary income, it's usually always related to tourism. And even at that, a lot of the people they'll sell to are restaurants, you know, are businesses that are still related to the tourism industry. So most of the economy in Galapagos is driven by the tourism industry. That being said, one of the things that came up in my survey as well, and is sort of like one of my recommendations, is there is a lot of interest from farmers in agritourism. It's something that's only like recently been starting. There's like 2-3 farms I can think of who like have really started integrating this. But when I talked to farmers, they were actually really interested in this. A lot of them were like, I have future plans, or I have ideas. And so that was actually a pretty good incentive. I think that's like a really cool point that we haven't capitalized on yet. That actually brings together a lot of these different pieces. It would made them more willing to plant native trees if they're interested in agritourism. And also, I mean, Darwin's finches are like pretty famous around the world, and there actually isn't a lot of like, when tourists come, there's not like, let's go look at the finches. I'm surprised, but I think there's like a lot more potential in terms of agritourism that hasn't really fully been developed yet. So I think that's kind of a cool, maybe in the future we can move in that direction. Yeah.